What happens when your own blood turns into vultures, tearing apart an estate before your mother's heart even stops beating? They thought they played me perfectly by stripping away everything and tossing me spare change out of pity. They never expected my frail mother to set a ruthless trap before her last breath. Listen closely. The greatest inheritance is not a billion-dollar empire, but a gold-plated mousetrap waiting for them to step inside. Hello and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. My dear listeners, unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us without the budget to continue our operations normally. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you can listen to even more incredible, exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we cannot publish here. You can easily join by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the Patreon link down in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us begin today's story, told from the perspective of our protagonist, Annie Holloway. I am 28 years old, and up until 4 months ago, my life was beautifully simple and grounded in nature. I worked as a passionate ecological planner at Emerald Canopy Strategies, a highly respected private consulting firm. I spent my days mapping out sustainable green spaces, analyzing soil compositions, and fighting to preserve the environment. But all of that came to a sudden, grinding halt. I took an unpaid leave of absence for 4 straight months, trading the vibrant, breathing forests of Washington for the sterile, suffocating white walls of a rundown Seattle hospital. I spent every waking moment sitting in a faded vinyl chair that smelled perpetually of cheap bleach and lingering despair, watching helplessly as the woman who gave me life slowly lost hers to terminal cancer. The hospital room was always terribly cold. It was an artificial, metallic chill that seemed to bypass my skin and seep directly into my bones, perfectly mirroring the sinking, dreadful reality that my mother was slipping away from me forever. I held her hand for hours on end, terrified to let go. Her fingers, which had once been so remarkably strong, capable, and full of warmth, were now terrifyingly fragile. Her skin was stretched impossibly thin over her delicate bones, feeling just like translucent parchment paper that might tear at the slightest touch. Every single shallow, rattling breath she took echoed loudly in the grim quiet of the room. It was a devastating, agonizing countdown that only she and I seemed to hear. And I emphasize that it was only she and I, because the room was suffocatingly empty. Where was the rest of my family during her final hours? Where was the man who had vowed to stand by her side in sickness and in health? Where were the other children she had raised and provided for? They were entirely glaringly absent. The silence in that hospital room was not just the typical quiet of a medical ward. It was a heavy, suffocating, and accusing silence born of ultimate betrayal and abandonment. The absolute proof of their cruelty was glowing brightly right there on my phone screen. I had sent a desperate, pleading message to our family group chat just 3 hours prior, begging them to come immediately because the doctors warned me she would not make it through the night. The replies I received in return were nothing short of sickening. My father, Julian, callously texted back claiming he was tied up with extremely important business out of state and could not possibly arrange to change his flight. My older brother, Mason, and my older sister, Elena, were somehow even worse. They casually mentioned they were attending an exclusive tech fundraising party, brushing off my frantic urgency with a brand of heartless indifference that made my stomach turn. But I knew the ugly truth hiding behind their excuses. They were not just casually networking, they were secretly celebrating. I knew they were currently standing in a lavish ballroom, raising crystal glasses of expensive champagne, eagerly anticipating the very second they would officially take over Nexus Vault Dynamics. That was the revolutionary, highly lucrative cybersecurity software company my brilliant mother had built entirely from the ground up, while she lay dying in a cheap hospital bed. Her own husband and eldest children were mentally spending her empire. Then, the monitor beside the bed suddenly let out a sharp, continuous, piercing sound, the flatline. That singular, relentless tone cut through the quiet room like a jagged physical blade. I froze completely, my heart shattering into a million irreparable pieces in my chest. A team of nurses rushed through the door, closely followed by the attending doctor, but it was far too late. There was absolutely nothing left to do. As the doctor gently checked her pulse and softly declared the official time of death, the very last shred of my emotional composure vanished into thin air. I collapsed heavily beside the bed, burying my face deep into the sterile white hospital sheets, sobbing violently until my lungs burned and I could no longer breathe. I was completely and utterly consumed by a profound, agonizing solitude. My mother was gone forever, and I was entirely alone in a family that had proven themselves to be nothing but greedy strangers. I do not know exactly how much time passed as I wept bitterly over her lifeless body. Eventually, the medical staff respectfully cleared out of the room, leaving only the attending doctor standing quietly near the doorway. He was an older man with a gentle face and incredibly weary eyes. He slowly walked over to my side of the bed. I braced myself, fully expecting him to offer the usual empty platitudes, the standard, hollow script of condolences about how she was no longer in pain and was in a better place now. But he did no such thing. He remained completely silent for a long moment, observing my immense grief with a highly solemn expression. Then, he reached deep into the pocket of his pristine white coat and pulled out a small object. He reached out and placed it gently into my trembling palm. The metal felt surprisingly heavy and ice-cold against my burning skin. I looked down through my tears and realized it was an antique silver pocket watch. I stared down at the object in total confusion, my vision completely blurred by my continuous crying. The doctor leaned in close to me and whispered in a remarkably low, urgent tone. "Your mother told me to hand this directly to you when she passed. She was incredibly specific about this. She instructed me to ensure that absolutely no one else in your family ever finds out about this exchange. You must keep it hidden from them. Everything you need is on the back." Before I could even formulate a single question or express my shock, he turned on his heel and quietly walked out of the room, leaving me completely alone with the heavy silver timepiece resting in my hands. My fingers shook violently as I ran my thumb over the intricate, beautiful engravings on the front of the watch, taking a deep, shuddering breath to try and steady my racing heart. I slowly turned it over. The smooth silver casing on the back felt slightly loose beneath my touch. Applying a tiny bit of pressure, I felt a small, distinct mechanical click. A concealed slot suddenly slid open. Tucked perfectly inside the hidden, velvet-lined compartment was a highly secure, encrypted micro USB drive. But that was not the most shocking part. Beneath the small drive, etched deeply into the silver casing with razor-sharp laser precision, was a single, chilling sentence. I wiped my stinging eyes and read the exact words my mother had left behind for me from the grave. "Do not cry for those who have no heart. Let them take the bloody crown they have always desired." My tears stopped instantly. The suffocating sorrow that had been entirely drowning me just moments before suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. A cold, quiet, and terrifyingly calm anger took deep root in my chest. And I realized in that very second that my mother had not just left me a simple inheritance. She had left me a loaded weapon. Exactly 3 days had passed since the funeral. The cloying, overwhelmingly sweet scent of white lilies and funeral roses still clung stubbornly to the fabric of my black mourning coat. That nauseating perfume was a constant, haunting reminder of the entirely hollow memorial service we had just endured. Julian did not even possess the basic decency to wait for the weekend to pass before making his next move. He summoned me to the sprawling, ostentatious suburban mansion before the damp earth on my mother's grave had even fully settled. His text message that morning was exceptionally brief and entirely devoid of any paternal warmth, stating merely that we needed to resolve mandatory legal procedures regarding the estate immediately. Walking into that massive, cold house felt exactly like stepping across enemy lines. The grand foyer, a beautiful space that used to echo with my mother's bright and commanding presence, now felt completely dead and sterile. I was swiftly directed by the housekeeper to the expansive home office situated at the very end of the long hallway. When I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors, the scene before me was entirely surreal and deeply sickening. Julian, Mason, and Elena were already gathered, completely dominating the room. There was absolutely no sign of mourning in their attire or their attitudes. None of them wore black. Julian was dressed impeccably in a sharp, tailored navy suit, looking every bit the ruthless executive. Mason sported an expensive, perfectly fitted gray blazer, while Elena wore a sleek designer emerald dress that screamed of high society vanity. They sat casually, their legs comfortably crossed on the plush, oversized Italian leather sofas. They were lightly swirling sparkling water in crystal glasses, their demeanor sickeningly relaxed and entirely indifferent. To them, this gathering was not a grieving family coming together to honor a beloved matriarch's final wishes. It was merely the final, administrative closing meeting of a highly anticipated corporate merger. Mr. Sterling, the longtime family lawyer who had known my mother for decades, sat rigidly behind the massive oak desk. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if he could physically feel the unnatural chill in the air. He pulled a thick, cream-colored envelope from his leather briefcase. The crisp sound of the heavy paper sliding across the polished mahogany desk seemed deafening in the quiet room. He cleared his throat loudly, deliberately adjusting his wire-rimmed reading glasses, and finally broke the heavy, suffocating silence. He formally announced that the legal document he was about to read was the official will, drafted and finalized exactly 4 years ago. Julian tapped his expensive fountain pen against his knee, clearly impatient for the formalities to conclude so he could officially claim his prize. As Mr. Sterling began reading through the dense, monotonous legal jargon, the grand prize they had all been salivating over was finally revealed in plain English. According to the binding terms of the document, Julian, Mason, and Elena were to divide exactly 100% of the voting shares of Nexus Vault Dynamics equally among the three of them. The cybersecurity empire, which was currently being aggressively valued by industry experts at tens of millions of dollars, was being handed over entirely to the exact same people who had abandoned its creator in her darkest hour. And then came the moment they had all been waiting for: my designated portion of the estate. Mr. Sterling's voice wavered slightly, losing its professional firmness as he read the final clauses concerning my inheritance. While my father and my 2 older siblings inherited a massive, thriving technology dynasty, I was officially bequeathed a dilapidated, rotting wooden cabin situated on a remote, overgrown patch of land on San Juan Island. Along with that crumbling structure came a single, pitiful lump sum cash payment of exactly $20,000. The contrast was so stark, so deliberately insulting, that the room fell completely silent for a fraction of a second. Then, Julian had the utter audacity to chuckle softly. He waved his manicured hand in the air as if swatting away a mildly annoying insect. He looked directly at me and mockingly referred to that pathetic cash sum as my generous plant passion support fund. A deeply condescending nod to my chosen career in ecological planning. Elena uncrossed her long legs and leaned forward, a thoroughly patronizing smirk plastered across her perfectly contoured face. "Let us be completely honest with each other for once," she purred smoothly, her tone dripping with a highly toxic, manufactured pity. "You should just take the $20,000 without making a fuss and quietly step away from all of this. You are far too weak, far too emotional, and you completely lack the ruthless business mind required to even step foot anywhere near a corporate board of directors. Mother clearly knew you could never handle the immense pressure of the real world. This arrangement is honestly for your own good. Go back to the woods and play with your dirt and your trees. Leave the heavy lifting to us." Mason immediately chimed in, scoffing loudly as he set his crystal glass down onto the glass coffee table with a sharp clink. He leaned his head back against the leather sofa, fully and shamelessly embodying the insufferable arrogance of a man who firmly believed he was just days away from officially becoming a billionaire. "Honestly, I am just annoyed that the estate accounts had to cover the outstanding maintenance fees and property taxes for that entirely useless pile of rotting wood on the island before we could legally transfer the deed to you. It is a complete and utter waste of our capital. You should probably just hire a crew to bulldoze the shack and sell the empty land for scrap before the roof collapses on your head. I listened to every single vile word they spoke. Keeping my chin tucked firmly against my chest, I deliberately let my shoulders slump forward, perfectly playing the exact role of the devastated, broken, and completely submissive youngest child they always assumed I was. I made absolute sure that my facial expression projected nothing but profound shock and helpless, defeated resignation. I let them believe they had won, that they had successfully crushed me under the sheer weight of their newly inherited wealth, but hidden completely out of their sight, buried deep within the warm, dark pocket of my heavy wool coat. My right hand was doing something else entirely. My fingers were wrapped tightly, almost bruisingly, around the cold, heavy silver of the antique pocket watch, the sharp metallic edges of the casing dug deeply into my palm, grounding me to reality and constantly reminding me of the laser-etched promise hidden inside. While my father and siblings sat there arrogantly gloating over their stolen corporate empire, completely and hopelessly blinded by their own towering greed and unchecked hubris, they had absolutely no idea that the real game had not even begun. The heavy wooden door of my cramped second-floor apartment clicked shut firmly behind me, successfully sealing away the highly toxic, suffocating atmosphere of the sprawling suburban mansion I had just narrowly escaped. I leaned my back against the solid doorframe for a long, quiet moment, letting the absolute silence of my modest living space slowly wash over my tense shoulders. It was a remarkably far cry from the opulent Italian leather and polished mahogany of Julian's pristine home office. But right now, this small room felt like the absolute safest fortress on earth. I shrugged off my dark wool morning coat, relieved that the cloying, lingering scent of funeral lilies was finally beginning to fade from my senses, swiftly replaced by the familiar, deeply comforting aroma of dried eucalyptus and old hardcover books that constantly filled my home. I walked with heavy, exhausted steps over to my small, battered wooden desk situated by the window and slowly pulled the antique silver pocket watch from my pocket. It still felt remarkably cold against my skin, serving as a heavy, undeniable anchor to the bizarre reality of what was about to unfold. I pressed my thumb against the edge, sliding the secret compartment open once more, and delicately extracted the tiny, encrypted micro USB drive. It looked so entirely unremarkable in the palm of my hand, merely a small sliver of black plastic and metal. Yet I knew with absolute certainty that it contained a seismic shift that would alter my entire existence. I booted up my laptop, the internal cooling fan whirring to life, sounding exceptionally loud in the dead quiet of the room, taking a deep, ragged, and steadying breath. I inserted the drive into the side port. A highly secure, aggressive encryption window immediately popped up on the very center of my screen, flashing a red warning and demanding a password. There were absolutely no helpful hints provided, no standard security questions to answer, just a stark, blinking cursor patiently waiting for the correct sequence of characters. I sat back in my chair, closing my eyes tightly, and thought deeply about my mother, the brilliant woman who had flawlessly built a digital security fortress from scratch would never, ever use something as predictably mundane as a birthday, an anniversary, or a childhood pet's name. She would strategically use something entirely untainted by the very people who had so callously betrayed her. Then, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. A single beautiful memory so vividly sharp and perfectly isolated from the rest of my toxic, fragmented family. It was the exact date she had first taken me camping deep in the dense, towering pine forests of the Pacific Northwest. Julian had flatly refused to go, aggressively claiming he despised the dirt and the bugs, while Mason and Elena had thrown massive, dramatic tantrums at the mere thought of sleeping in a canvas tent without reliable cellular service. So, it had been just the two of us, sitting peacefully by a crackling fire under a canopy of endless stars, roasting marshmallows while she patiently taught me how to properly identify different species of native trees. I opened my eyes, leaned forward, and carefully typed that exact date out in words on the keyboard. The complex encryption software accepted the code instantly. The progress bar flashed a bright, approving green, and a single, isolated video file appeared in the main directory. The digital timestamp indicated it had been recorded exactly 5 months ago, right around the time her initial, devastating terminal diagnosis had been officially confirmed by the oncology board. My hand trembled visibly as I maneuvered the mouse and double-clicked the file. The screen flickered brightly to life, and suddenly, there she was. My breath caught sharply in my throat, a painful lump forming instantly. She was sitting perfectly upright in her private home study, bathed in the soft, warm, golden glow of her favorite brass reading lamp. She already looked incredibly thin, the aggressive illness having already begun to ruthlessly carve hollows into her elegant cheekbones, but her posture was impeccably, defiantly straight. What struck me most, however, was the profound intensity of her eyes. They were absolutely not the eyes of a dying, defeated, or frightened woman. They were as sharp as freshly honed daggers, completely lucid, intensely focused, and radiating a terrifying, ice-cold clarity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Hello, Annie." Her familiar voice played smoothly through the laptop speakers, incredibly steady and entirely devoid of any sentimental, tearful wavering. If you are currently watching this recording, it means the vultures have already descended. It means the medical machinery has finally stopped beeping, and Julian, along with your brother and sister, are currently patting themselves on the back, completely convinced they have successfully stolen my entire life's work. She paused for a fraction of a second, her expression hardening into a terrifying mask of pure, calculated fury. "I need you to listen to me very carefully right now. 5 months ago, when the doctors sat me down and gave me my terminal prognosis, I immediately noticed how unusually eager your father was to handle the restructuring of my estate planning. His sudden, overwhelming helpfulness was entirely out of character and deeply suspicious. So, I discreetly hired a team of elite, independent private investigators to follow his every move." She leaned slightly closer to the camera lens, her voice dropping into a deadly, conspiratorial whisper that seemed to echo in my small apartment. The truth they rapidly uncovered was profoundly ugly. Your father has been actively carrying on a long-term affair with a much younger mistress, and the two of them had already begun laying the extensive, complex financial groundwork to systematically siphon my personal assets into hidden offshore accounts the very second my heart permanently stopped beating. But the betrayal absolutely did not end there. My brilliant investigators also managed to intercept heavily encrypted corporate emails between Mason, Elena, and the executive board of our biggest, most aggressive corporate rival, your siblings. The very children I raised, housed, and educated had secretly brokered a highly illegal, backdoor agreement to sell my entire cybersecurity company to them for a mere fraction of its true market value. They were planning to pocket the quick cash and entirely dissolve my legacy before my body was even cold. I sat completely frozen in my desk chair, staring blankly at the glowing screen in absolute horror. The sheer, unadulterated magnitude of their treachery was suffocating, but my mother did not shed a single, solitary tear on the video. Instead, a slow, incredibly chilling smile spread across her pale, chapped lips. "Most ordinary people would have confronted them immediately," she continued, her tone now laced with a dark, triumphant, and deeply satisfying malice. "Most people would have tragically wasted their final precious months on earth screaming, crying, and fighting exhausting, expensive legal battles in a public courtroom. I chose a drastically different path. I spent the last half year of my life confined to my bed, quietly utilizing every single ounce of my remaining physical strength and intellect to execute an entirely invisible financial coup right under their arrogant, unsuspecting noses, I have meticulously, legally, and completely turned the thriving company they are so utterly desperate to inherit into an empty, rotting shell. She took a slow, deliberate sip of water from a glass on her desk before turning back to deliver the final, crushing blow. I know they humiliated you today in that office. I know they proudly handed you the deed to the San Juan Island cabin and laughed directly in your face, mocking you and calling it a pathetic, worthless pile of garbage. Let them laugh. Annie, what those arrogant, short-sighted fools completely failed to realize is that the wooden cabin itself is just a clever visual decoy. Directly beneath the rotting floorboards of that crumbling structure is a state-of-the-art, heavily climate-controlled, subterranean server vault, and securely locked inside that vault sits the only existing copy of our next-generation source code. That specific code is the true, beating heart of my empire, the genuine intellectual property that holds all the actual, tangible market value, and I have legally, irrevocably, and secretly transferred 100% of its ownership rights exclusively to you. Her piercing eyes seemed to cut right through the digital screen, locking onto mine with an intense, burning, and absolute command. Your directive now is incredibly simple, but you must execute it flawlessly without a single mistake. You must let them sign the official legal waiver relinquishing all of their rights and future claims to that wooden cabin and the remote land it sits on. Let them firmly believe they are forcing you into pathetic submission. Let them genuinely think it is worthless, expensive garbage. Do not fight them on it for even a second, because the reality is, they are actually throwing away the only key that can possibly save their own lives from the hell I have prepared for them. Do exactly as I say, my brave girl, and simply watch the massive empire they thought they stole crumble entirely into dust. The video player abruptly cut to black, leaving me sitting perfectly still in the deafening silence of my apartment, my heart pounding a frantic, victorious rhythm against my ribs as the sheer, devastating brilliance of her revenge finally illuminated the dark, righteous path ahead. After the screen of my laptop faded to black, I sat completely motionless in the deafening quiet of my apartment, my mind racing at a frantic pace to fully comprehend the sheer, staggering scale of what I had just witnessed. I carefully guided the mouse to the remaining folders stored securely on the encrypted drive. There were dozens of meticulously organized digital directories, each containing hundreds of scanned legal documents, complex corporate filings, and highly confidential internal memos. As I began to slowly read through the dense, heavy financial texts, the absolute brilliance of my mother's invisible war steadily unfolded before my eyes. She had not simply hidden the best parts of her life's work. She had actively, methodically, and ruthlessly hollowed it out from the inside. The massive empire known as Nexus Vault Dynamics, the very same entity my father and siblings were currently popping expensive champagne over, was a complete and utter illusion. According to the certified legal documents I was currently reading, my mother had quietly dissolved or transferred every single valuable patent the company held. She had brilliantly exploited obscure, highly technical loopholes in corporate intellectual property law to legally sever the core technology from the main business entity. The massive tech corporation they were so eager to inherit was nothing more than an empty, glossy shell. It still proudly possessed the famous name, the sleek corporate logo, and the incredibly expensive downtown Seattle offices, but fundamentally, it owned absolutely nothing of actual, intrinsic value. But simply leaving them a worthless company was nowhere near enough for a woman who had been so profoundly and violently betrayed by her own flesh and blood. She wanted to guarantee their complete, inescapable, and absolute ruin. The very next encrypted folder I opened contained digital copies of 3 massive, newly minted service contracts. Just weeks before her physical condition rapidly deteriorated, my mother had personally leveraged her stellar, undisputed industry reputation to secure 3 unprecedented, highly classified cybersecurity provisioning agreements directly with the federal government. These were absolutely not standard, run-of-the-mill corporate deals that could be easily renegotiated. These were ironclad, heavily monitored federal contracts demanding the highest possible level of digital protection for sensitive government data. And buried deep within the hundreds of pages of these binding government agreements was a terrifyingly strict, completely unyielding non-compliance penalty clause. If Nexus Vault Dynamics failed to deliver the required software updates on time and maintain the stringent security protocols, the company would be immediately hit with a catastrophic breach of contract fine. The penalty was absolutely staggering. It was set at exactly $40 million. The true devastating genius of her trap lay entirely in the technical execution of the software. A detailed, handwritten note from my mother, perfectly scanned into a high-resolution image file, explained the underlying trap mechanism with chilling, surgical precision. Before she was permanently confined to her hospital bed, she had secretly accessed the central developer servers in the middle of the night and deliberately introduced a complex, deeply hidden obsolescence code into the current flagship software, the very program that the federal government was currently relying on, the exact same product that generated all of the company's current surface-level revenue, was fundamentally rigged from the inside out. It was a ticking digital time bomb. According to her meticulous, flawless calculations, the software would suffer a catastrophic, unfixable system failure and completely stop working in exactly 1 month, when that inevitable system-wide crash happened. The federal government would instantly demand the new, upgraded patch to restore their critical security. But that vital update did not exist anywhere on the main corporate servers. The only complete, functioning, and legally valid copy of that next-generation source code was safely locked away in the highly secure subterranean server vault located directly underneath my remote wooden cabin. Without my specific code, the company would absolutely fail to meet the strict federal deadline, instantly triggering the catastrophic penalty clause. Yet, my mother knew perfectly well that a simple corporate bankruptcy would not be enough to truly punish Julian, Mason, and Elena. In a standard bankruptcy, they would simply walk away unscathed, cowardly hiding behind the standard legal protections of a limited liability corporation, and continue living their lavish, disgusting lives using the money they had already planned to steal and hide offshore. So, she brilliantly and ruthlessly changed the fundamental rules of the game. I opened a file distinctly labeled as legal restructuring, and my jaw practically dropped in pure awe. In the agonizing months leading up to her death, she had quietly, legally reclassified the core structure of the executive board. She had woven a highly complex, incredibly aggressive joint and several liability clauses into the brand new corporate bylaws. It was legally binding, heavily fortified by top-tier corporate lawyers she had hired in secret, and entirely inescapable. This explicitly meant that when the software inevitably crashed, and the company completely failed to pay the $40 million federal penalty, the protective corporate veil would instantly shatter into 1,000,000 pieces. The federal government would not just seize the worthless company assets. They would be legally authorized and heavily incentivized to aggressively seize the personal assets of the controlling board members to satisfy the massive debt. Their sprawling, ostentatious suburban mansions, their imported luxury vehicles, their hidden offshore accounts, their stock portfolios, absolutely everything would be completely wiped out by federal auditors. The exact moment they officially accepted their roles as the majority shareholders and directors, they unknowingly strapped a $40 million anvil directly to their own necks. Why was she so incredibly confident that they would actually fall for this devastating, elaborate trap? Another scanned note from her explained their fatal psychological flaw perfectly. She wrote clearly that they were fundamentally arrogant, incredibly greedy, and profoundly lazy. She knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that they would be far too eager to claim their unearned prize to ever bother conducting a rigorous, independent internal audit of the recent corporate books. They would simply look at the massive, superficial revenue streams currently flowing in. They would see the incredibly shiny federal contracts, and their overwhelming greed would completely blind them to the underlying, fatal danger. They were so utterly focused on the impending, highly lucrative merger with the rival tech conglomerate that they would never even dream of questioning the structural integrity of the asset they were aggressively trying to sell. They genuinely believed they were the smartest people in the entire room, wholly incapable of comprehending that a dying, bedridden woman could so thoroughly and masterfully outmaneuver them. Their own towering, unchecked hubris was the final, essential ingredient needed to seal their inescapable doom. My mother had done all of the heavy lifting, setting the board perfectly for a flawless, brutal checkmate. But there was one final, absolutely critical move that had to be made, and it rested entirely on my shoulders. The final document located in the folder was a specific, highlighted set of instructions directed solely at me. When the $40 million bomb finally detonated, the resulting legal fallout would be incredibly violent, messy, and totally indiscriminate. If I was not properly, legally shielded, the federal lawyers might attempt to drag me down with the rest of the family simply because I was a named heir in the original will. My mission was crystal clear and completely vital to my own survival. I had to manipulate Julian, Mason, and Elena into willingly signing a comprehensive, legally bulletproof mutual release of all claims. I desperately needed a formal, notarized declaration stating that my inheritance of the San Juan Island property was entirely separate from the main corporate estate, and that neither party could ever hold the other liable for any future corporate debts, lawsuits, or disputes. I had to willingly walk right back into the lion's den and play my part perfectly. I had to act exactly like the pathetic, discarded, and grieving younger daughter they fully expected me to be. I had to make them feel so incredibly powerful, so thoroughly victorious, that they would eagerly sign away their only possible lifeline, fully believing they were just taking out the trash and securing their own wealth. The trap was beautifully set, perfectly primed, and waiting patiently in the dark. All I had to do now was hand them the pen and watch them destroy themselves. The very next morning, the heavy gray clouds hanging over the city perfectly matched the deeply depressing facade I had carefully constructed. I arrived at the prestigious downtown law firm exactly on time, having spent the entire night meticulously preparing for the most critical performance of my entire life. I had deliberately deprived myself of sleep, leaving my skin looking terribly pale and exhausted. I rigorously rubbed my eyes until they were swollen and entirely bloodshot, ensuring I looked exactly like the shattered, discarded, and desperately heartbroken youngest daughter they fully expected to see. When I slowly pushed open the thick glass door of the main conference room, I made sure my shoulders were hunched defensively, projecting an aura of complete and utter defeat. Julian, Mason, and Elena were already seated around the massive, polished granite conference table. They looked remarkably eager, vibrating with a toxic, restless energy. The second I took a seat at the far end of the long table, my father did not even bother offering a basic morning greeting. Instead, Julian aggressively tossed a thick, rigidly bound legal file across the smooth granite surface. It slid rapidly and hit the edge of my arm. He leaned forward, resting his tailored elbows on the table, and coldly ordered me to review the documents. He bluntly explained that the paperwork was a comprehensive, legally binding mutual release of all claims. He demanded that I sign away every single right to ever dispute the will, legally severing myself and my inherited property from any past, present, or future association with Nexus Vault Dynamics, in exchange for completely disappearing from their lives and abandoning any claim to the corporate empire. They would immediately transfer the deed to the wooden cabin, neatly tying up the loose ends of the estate. I stared down at the stark black ink on the pristine white pages, perfectly hiding the wild, triumphant racing of my heart. This was exactly what my mother had anticipated. They were practically begging me to install the final lock on their own prison cell. Mason let out a loud, deeply irritated sigh from across the table, loudly tapping his expensive leather dress shoes against the carpeted floor. He glared at me with absolute contempt. "Sign it quickly, so your brother can actually go and close the massive company merger contract this afternoon. We have a highly lucrative deal with a major tech conglomerate waiting for our final signatures. There is absolutely no room for your pathetic tears here, so just get it over with." I knew I had to sell the illusion completely to ensure they never suspected a thing. I slowly reached for the heavy silver pen provided by the notary. Forcing my fingers to tremble violently, I took a sharp, ragged breath, successfully squeezing out a few thick, entirely manufactured tears of profound resentment. I let the salty drops fall heavily onto the bottom edge of the signature page, intentionally blurring a tiny bit of the printed text. I hovered the tip of the pen just a millimeter above the designated line, visibly hesitating, acting as though signing away my connection to the family business was tearing my soul apart. My calculated hesitation worked flawlessly, instantly driving Elena to the absolute brink of her extremely limited patience. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand flat against the granite table, her voice shrill and commanding. "Stop being so incredibly dramatic and just put the pen on the paper. You are getting exactly what you deserve. Take your useless piece of dirt on the island and let the actual adults handle the real business. Sign the document right now, or we will tie you up in expensive legal battles for the next 10 years until you have absolutely nothing left." I looked up at her, offering one final, perfectly crafted expression of helpless surrender, and brought the pen down. My hand swept across the paper, leaving my signature in smooth, dark blue ink. The moment I lifted the pen, the independent public notary stepped forward, swiftly collected the documents, and firmly pressed his heavy red official stamp beside my name. The loud, definitive thud of the stamp echoing in the quiet room was the sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and utterly nauseating. Before the notary had even packed his briefcase to leave, Julian casually reached into a silver ice bucket resting on a nearby side table and pulled out a chilled bottle of incredibly expensive vintage champagne. The loud pop of the cork echoed violently against the glass walls of the conference room. My father and my two older siblings immediately stood up, completely ignoring my presence as they poured the sparkling liquid into crystal flutes. They openly clinked their glasses together, loudly laughing and blatantly mocking my apparent naivety. They toasted to their newfound wealth, completely convinced they had just executed a flawless, ruthless victory against a weak, overly emotional obstacle. I sat quietly in my chair, watching them celebrate their stolen triumph. I did not say a single word as I carefully placed the finalized property deed into my worn leather tote bag. Let them laugh. Let them drink their expensive vintage champagne and dream about their impending millions. They were entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality closing in around them. They had absolutely no idea that the wet ink drying on those legal papers had just permanently severed their one and only safety line. By forcing me to sign that mutual release, Julian, Mason, and Elena had successfully locked themselves into an inescapable $40 million pit of federal debt, while leaving me completely, legally, and brilliantly untouched. The trap was now permanently shut. Exactly 4 weeks later, the grand ballroom of the most exclusive five-star hotel in downtown Seattle was buzzing with an electric, intoxicating energy. Flashbulbs from industry photographers illuminated the lavish space, reflecting off crystal chandeliers and towering champagne towers. At the very front of the room, on a highly elevated stage, sat Julian, Mason, and Elena. They were practically glowing with unchecked arrogance. Behind them, a massive digital banner proudly announced the historic merger of Nexus Vault Dynamics with the largest tech conglomerate on the West Coast. In just a few moments, they were scheduled to sign the final, binding legal agreements that would officially sell my mother's hijacked legacy for a staggering $60 million. I stood quietly in the darkened corridor just outside the heavy double doors of the ballroom, checking my silver pocket watch one last time. The software bomb my mother had planted had officially detonated exactly 2 hours ago. Federal networks were currently flashing red across the country, and the trap was perfectly primed. I gave a sharp nod to the individuals standing beside me. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom were suddenly thrust open with a deafening crash that instantly silenced the murmuring crowd and the soft classical music playing in the background. Every single head in the room snapped around to look at the entrance. I walked straight down the center aisle, leaving the pathetic, weeping younger sister act far behind me. I was wearing a razor-sharp, tailored black business suit, my posture impeccable, and my expression carved from pure ice. Flanking me on either side were two senior federal auditors donning grim expressions and dark suits, followed closely by a highly aggressive, top-tier legal team I had hired the week before. Up on the stage, the smug smiles on the faces of my father and siblings completely vanished, instantly replaced by deep, ugly scowls of confusion and outrage. Mason stood up rapidly, knocking his chair backward, and grabbed a microphone. He angrily demanded to know what I was doing ruining their press conference. I did not bother to answer him. I simply kept walking until I reached the front row, where the chief executive officer of the rival tech conglomerate was sitting, pen in hand, waiting to sign the $60 million purchase agreement. My lead attorney confidently stepped forward and slammed a thick, red folder directly onto the lap of the rival executive. He firmly instructed the man to read the top page before signing away his company's capital. The executive shot an annoyed glare at Mason, but opened the folder anyway. I watched in absolute silence as the color rapidly drained from the executive's face. His eyes darted frantically across the text, detailing the catastrophic software failure and the missing intellectual property. A deep, furious purple flushed his cheeks. He suddenly stood up, marched directly to the edge of the stage, and violently hurled the entire stack of documents right into Mason's face. The papers fluttered through the air like dead leaves. The executive screamed into the microphone that the software was completely dead. The company was a fraudulent shell, and the entire acquisition was immediately canceled. Complete chaos erupted in the ballroom. Reporters began shouting, cameras flashed wildly, and investors frantically scrambled for the exits. Amidst the deafening uproar, one of the federal auditors calmly walked up the stairs to the stage, completely ignoring Julian's frantic demands for an explanation. The auditor grabbed the microphone, and his booming voice echoed throughout the chaotic room. He officially announced an immediate, comprehensive freeze on all corporate and personal assets belonging to the executive board. He plainly stated that Nexus Vault Dynamics had catastrophically breached 3 classified government contracts because their core security software had completely ceased to function. The mandatory penalty fee of $40 million was now due immediately, and because of the newly restructured corporate bylaws they had so eagerly embraced without reading, that massive $40 million debt would be aggressively seized directly from the personal bank accounts, properties, and assets of Julian, Mason, and Elena. The sheer gravity of the auditor's words hit the 3 of them like a freight train. Elena physically collapsed into her chair, gasping for air as if she were suddenly choking. Julian's face turned a sickening shade of gray, his confident, executive posture completely crumbling in an instant. Mason, however, panicked. He scrambled down from the stage, his eyes wide and unhinged, and rushed toward me. He screamed frantically, begging me to hand over the new source code, demanding I give them access to the subterranean server vault on the island so they could patch the federal systems and stop the massive fines. He desperately pleaded that we were family and that I had to save them from total financial ruin. I looked him dead in the eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness where my grief used to be. Slowly and deliberately, I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of paper. I held it up high for him, my father, my sister, and every single remaining reporter in the room to see clearly. It was the heavily notarized mutual release of all claims. "I am so sorry, Mason," I said, my voice projecting a cold, cutting clarity that sliced right through the lingering noise of the ballroom. "But as you all legally certified just 4 weeks ago, I have absolutely no connection to Nexus Vault Dynamics. My property on San Juan Island and everything underneath it belongs solely to me, completely independent of your debts. I am under no legal or moral obligation to save you from the bed you made. You wanted the crown, so now you have to wear it." The aftermath of that day was remarkably swift and completely unforgiving. Julian, Mason, and Elena were instantly crushed under the unyielding weight of the $40 million federal judgment. They were forced to declare immediate, humiliating personal bankruptcy. The government ruthlessly seized their sprawling suburban mansions, auctioned off their imported luxury vehicles, and completely drained their domestic accounts. Furthermore, the intense federal scrutiny uncovered their sloppy, illegal attempts to funnel money into hidden offshore accounts, resulting in all three of them facing severe, multi-year federal prison sentences for aggravated tax fraud and financial evasion. They lost absolutely everything. As for me, I held all the cards. I independently licensed the new, fully functional source code directly to the federal government on my own terms, generating tens of millions of dollars in clean, undisputed revenue. I used a large portion of that immense wealth to establish a massive, fully funded ecological preservation charity in my mother's true name, ensuring her brilliant legacy would forever protect the forests we both loved so deeply. I retreated to my beautiful wooden cabin on San Juan Island, surrounded by towering pine trees and the soothing sound of the ocean, finally living a remarkably free, incredibly bright, and brilliantly peaceful life. The gold-plated mousetrap had snapped shut perfectly, and I was the only one left standing in the light. Thank you so much for listening to the conclusion of this incredible journey. My wonderful audience, I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from today, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story thrilling and want to support our channel, please join the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community to hear the absolute best, highly exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Have a beautiful day, and stay strong.